In the depths of Vicksburg's historic district stands Paxton Mansion, a grand, crumbling relic with a dark and mournful past. Built in the 1800s, it was once a symbol of prosperity, but the Civil War turned it into a hospital for wounded soldiers, a place of suffering and death. Locals say its walls absorbed every groan, every cry, and every final breath. Late at night, the mansion is said to awaken. Ghostly figures emerge from the shadows, lingering only long enough for a passerby to catch a glimpse before fading back into the darkness. Many have reported seeing soldiers in ragged, blood-stained uniforms standing near the mansion's entrance. Their expressions are empty, their eyes dark hollows as if they are lost in some eternal, unending battle. Witnesses have tried to approach them, but the soldiers disappear, dissolving like mist as soon as anyone gets too close. One of the most haunting apparitions is a woman in white, thought to be the spirit of a young nurse named Evelyn. She was known for her gentle nature and kindness, tending to countless soldiers until she fell ill and perished within the mansion's walls. People have seen her drifting through the mansion's upper windows, her pale face peering out as if waiting for something or someone. Others have felt her cold touch brush across their skin, a whisper of her presence as she moves past. There is a story of a man, an amateur ghost hunter, who stayed overnight in the mansion. Armed with recording equipment, he wanted to capture proof of the spirits that haunted Paxton. He set up cameras in the rooms once used as makeshift hospital wards. As the hours dragged on, he began to feel an intense coldness enveloping him, the air thick with an unnatural silence. But it was when he heard the sound of footsteps behind him, heavy, dragging footsteps, that he felt true fear. The man turned to see a soldier in Confederate gray, his face gaunt and hollow, with blood seeping from a wound in his chest. The figure reached out to him, mouthing words he couldn't understand. But when he played back the recording, he heard a faint whisper, "Help me. Please help us." Since that night, he refuses to speak of Paxton Mansion, and he warns anyone who will listen. Some souls there are trapped, reliving their final moments, unable to find peace. And those who visit may be drawn in, caught in the echo of that dark history, becoming part of Paxton Mansion's legacy of restless spirits. The man never spoke of his experience at Paxton Mansion again, but he couldn't shake the image of the soldier's hollow eyes and outstretched hand. He tried to move on, to forget the cold chill that had followed him out of the mansion and into the night. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw that soldier, standing just behind him, waiting. Weeks later, unable to resist the pull of the mansion, he returned. This time he wasn't alone. A group of fellow ghost hunters had heard his tale and were eager to see for themselves if Paxton Mansion truly lived up to its haunted reputation. They arrived just before sunset, the warm light casting long shadows across the mansion's cracked facade. But even in the fading daylight, the house looked oppressive, its towering, rotting frame casting a looming, sorrowful presence over the town. As they stepped through the creaking front door, the air seemed to shift. It was heavier than outside, thick with the scent of mildew and old blood. The group set up their equipment, cameras and recorders, all while murmuring excitedly about the possibilities of capturing something supernatural. But the man, his heart heavy with unease, felt the first flickers of dread crawling up his spine. This place, it wasn't like other haunted sites he'd visited. There was something here, something ancient, watching. They made their way into the grand hallway, its walls adorned with peeling wallpaper and faded portraits of people who no longer seemed alive. The woman in white was said to appear often in this very room, and the air seemed to grow colder with each step they took. One of the hunters, a skeptic, laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood, but the sound of his voice seemed to make the shadows shift, like they were listening. Then the lights flickered. For a moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. And then footsteps, soft at first like the shuffle of someone walking in slippers. But then they grew louder, heavier, the sound of boots dragging across the floor. The group froze. The skeptic grabbed his flashlight and swept it across the room. But the beam only illuminated empty space. The footsteps continued, growing closer, until they were right behind them. "Who's there?" the skeptic called, his voice shaking. But it wasn't just the sound of footsteps now. The air was alive with whispers, faint but unmistakable, as if dozens of voices were speaking all at once, muffled by the thick walls of the mansion. The woman in white was close, her mournful gaze, her outstretched arms. Without warning, the man felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, but no one was there. The air seemed to hum with energy, and the temperature plummeted. "Let's get out of here," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. But before they could make a move, one of the hunters pointed toward the stairs. A figure, dressed in tattered gray, was standing at the top. The soldier, the same one from the man's earlier vision. The hunter raised his camera, but before he could take a picture, the figure began to move slowly, deliberately down the stairs, its gaze fixed on them. And that's when they realized something far more terrifying. The soldier wasn't alone. Behind him, from the dark recesses of the mansion, other figures began to emerge, more soldiers, their faces twisted in pain, dragging their bodies along as if they had never truly left the battlefield. Their eyes burned with unfulfilled rage and sorrow. The room began to close in, the walls groaning under the weight of their presence. The woman in white was no longer a distant vision. She was there, standing in front of the group, her eyes filled with grief, her hands reaching out in desperate plea. "Please," one of the hunters whispered, his voice barely a breath. "What do you want?" The woman's lips parted, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The voice was not hers, but something deeper, more ancient. "We are waiting," it said, "waiting for the living to join us." The man's heart raced, his thoughts scrambling. What did they mean? What did they want? But then, just as suddenly as the spirits had appeared, everything fell silent. The shadows no longer moved. The cold retreated. The whispers died. The group stood in the dead silence of the room, breathless, afraid to move. Something had changed. Something in the house had shifted. They turned to leave, but the door once wide open was now shut tight. The woman in white stood in front of it, blocking their way. "Help us," she whispered, her voice echoing in their minds. "You can never leave until you help us find peace." But no one knew how to answer. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The air grew thick again, and the temperature dropped even further, as if the walls of Paxton Mansion had begun to close in around them. The group backed up, hands trembling, their hearts thudding in their chests. The woman in white didn't move, her expression soft, yet impossibly sorrowful, as if she had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The soldier at the top of the stairs didn't move either, but his hollow eyes followed every motion, every twitch, as if studying the hunters for weaknesses, like a predator sizing up its prey. Slowly, he began to descend the stairs, his feet dragging, each step a painful echo in the oppressive silence. "We have to get out of here," the skeptic stammered, his voice unrecognizable in his panic. But no one made a move to escape. The door was still blocked, the woman in white standing just a few feet away, her eyes pleading. The man, the one who had visited the mansion before, felt the weight of something pressing on his chest, an invisible force that felt almost like a warning. This wasn't just a ghost. These weren't just spirits of the dead. They were trapped, and they weren't going to let anyone leave until their suffering was acknowledged, their stories told. The soldier's voice suddenly broke through the stillness, soft and broken, yet unmistakable. "You will help us." The man's breath hitched. He knew this wasn't a question. It was a command, a plea. These souls had been waiting for so long, and now, in the presence of the living, they had an opportunity to be heard. The man turned to the others, desperation in his eyes. "We need to listen to them. They're asking us for something. Maybe we can help." One of the other hunters, a woman with dark, determined eyes, shook her head. "Help them how? They're dead. There's nothing we can do." But the man didn't answer. He was staring at the soldier at the bottom of the stairs, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the words he had heard earlier. "Help me. Please help us." Without thinking, he stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward the woman in white. "We want to help you," he whispered. "We'll listen." The woman's eyes flickered, her sorrow deepening as if she had heard his words and recognized the weight behind them. For a moment, she just stood there, gazing at him with an unspoken understanding, as if searching his soul. Then, without warning, the mansion seemed to groan, and the temperature plummeted even further, colder than he had ever felt in his life. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. And then, the soldier spoke again, his voice growing louder, more urgent, almost pleading. "You have to listen. They are coming." Suddenly, the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. The faintest whispers grew into a cacophony, voices rising from every corner of the mansion, and the walls seemed to pulse with an eerie, spectral energy. A flash of movement in the corner of the room caught the man's attention. More figures, soldiers emerging from the shadows, as though they had been waiting for something to awaken. They weren't just shadows. These soldiers were dressed in the remnants of their uniforms, ragged, torn, stained with blood. Some wore their wounds as if they were marks of honor. Others looked gaunt and hollow, their faces drained of life. And yet, they moved, stepping closer to the group, dragging their limbs slowly, as if every movement caused them pain. The woman in white began to float closer, her long, translucent gown swirling around her, her feet not touching the floor. "You must listen," she repeated, her voice so faint it was almost a sigh. "Their souls, they are bound to this place. They cannot move on until you hear them." The man's heart raced, and a sudden dread gripped him. These were not mere ghosts. These were the spirits of men who had fought and died, their lives lost to the chaos of war. They had been forgotten, their sacrifices unacknowledged. And now they were asking for something he wasn't sure he could give. "How can we help you?" the man asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. The soldier who had been standing at the top of the stairs, now close enough to touch, locked eyes with him. "You must hear our stories," the soldier rasped, his voice hoarse, as if it had not been used in years. "You must remember the blood, the death, the men who fought and died here. Tell our story. Let the world know we are not forgotten." Before the man could respond, the ground trembled again, this time with more force. The temperature dropped so sharply it felt like ice was seeping into his bones. The mansion seemed to shift, the walls groaning as if waking from a long, tortured slumber. And that's when they heard it, the sound of marching feet. The unmistakable sound of soldiers advancing, though the hallway before them was empty. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with desperate cries, and the lights flickered violently as a cold wind swept through the mansion. It was as if the spirits were being drawn closer, pulling the living into their eternal struggle. The woman in white reached out toward the group, her fingers trembling as she spoke, her voice almost drowned by the rising storm of spirits. "You must help us. We are not the only ones." The man's eyes widened in horror as the shadows in the corners of the room began to take form. More figures, more soldiers, more faces twisted in agony. This was not just a handful of restless souls. This was a whole army, trapped in time, and they were waiting for something. But what? The room seemed to close in around them, the walls groaning under the weight of the gathering spirits. The air grew thick with the presence of those long lost, their sorrow and anger pressing against the group like a suffocating fog. The woman in white hovered near the man, her ethereal form flickering in and out of focus, her expression pleading. "You must listen," she repeated, her voice barely audible over the growing storm of whispers and distant, phantom footsteps. "We are many, and there are others still waiting for you." The soldier at the bottom of the stairs, now standing directly in front of them, stepped forward with deliberate slowness. His uniform was tattered, his face a hollow mask of pain, and his eyes burned with the intensity of a man desperate for release. He reached out toward the man, his hand trembling as if the weight of centuries were too much to bear. "Tell our story," the soldier rasped, his voice as dry as dust. "You must remember us. You must speak for us so we may find peace." The man's heart pounded in his chest. The others were frozen in place, fear rooted in their limbs as the soldier's words settled in their minds. They were being asked to carry a burden they weren't sure they could bear. This wasn't a simple haunting. This wasn't just about restless souls seeking closure. This was about the weight of history itself, the bloodshed, the lives lost, the stories left untold. And yet, the man felt something stir within him, something beyond fear and obligation, a responsibility. These spirits weren't just asking for recognition. They were demanding it. Their voices, each one a thread in the tapestry of a forgotten war, rising up in unison, echoing through the mansion's decaying walls. The skeptic, now wide-eyed and pale, took a step back. What the hell is going on? This is impossible. His breath came in short, shallow gasps as he fumbled for his flashlight. There's got to be a logical explanation for all this. This isn't real. This isn't happening. But the woman in white raised her hand, and a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the flashlights and plunging them into darkness. Only the faint, flickering light of the dying candles on the tables illuminated the faces of the soldiers, pale and transparent, their gazes fixed on the living. "You think we are not real?" The voice of the soldier from the stairs rang out, more commanding now, as the mansion seemed to tremble. "We have always been here. You are the ones who are blind, who refuse to see. But we will show you the truth." The room suddenly felt alive, as if the very foundation of Paxton Mansion was shifting, bending under the pressure of the spirit's yearning. The ground beneath their feet seemed to quiver, and the sound of marching feet grew louder, closer. The air grew colder, until their breath formed icy clouds before them. And then, from the shadows, more figures began to emerge, more soldiers, more restless souls, all of them moving toward the group with slow, deliberate steps. Their faces were blank slates, their bodies a blur of worn uniforms and tattered gear, but their eyes, those eyes burned with an intensity that demanded attention. The woman in white was no longer just an apparition. She had grown more solid, her gown flowing around her like mist, her face twisted in sorrow. One by one, the soldiers stopped before the group, their ghostly hands extended in silent demand. The man stepped back, his mind racing. They weren't just looking for recognition, they were looking for someone to carry their memory into the world. They needed their story to be told, their pain to be acknowledged, before they could finally rest. A voice, deep and hollow, emerged from one of the soldiers, a man whose face was half concealed by the tattered remnants of his uniform. "We fought. We bled," the voice echoed, growing louder, more insistent with each word. "We died here alone, forgotten by the living, our stories lost to time. You must remember us so that we may be free." The man's mind was spinning, his chest tight with fear, but something inside him urged him to listen. These spirits weren't just haunting the mansion for themselves. They were trapped in a limbo, cursed to wander until someone came to bear witness to their lives, to give voice to the silenced memories of those who had fallen. He turned to his companions. "We have to do it. We have to help them." But before anyone could respond, the room began to shift again. The floor beneath their feet trembled violently, and the walls seemed to sway as though the very mansion itself were alive, possessed by the spirits it had trapped for so long. The temperature dropped even further, until their skin felt as though it were being pierced by needles of cold. From the farthest corner of the room, a new figure emerged, a towering man, his uniform pristine, his face stern and regal, yet unmistakably ancient. His eyes glowed faintly with a soft, ethereal light as he approached the group, his presence commanding their attention. "They are not the only ones," the man's voice boomed, his tone deep and heavy with authority. "There are others, more than you can count. And they have waited, for centuries." The room went deathly silent, and for the first time since they had entered the mansion, the group felt as if they were no longer in control. The spirits, the soldiers, the woman in white, they were not just haunting the mansion. They were bound to it. And now, the man realized, they had no choice but to listen. They had no choice but to uncover the truth. But what truth? And where would it lead them? As if in answer, the soldier's voice echoed once more, louder than ever before. "You will know soon." And with that, the mansion seemed to come alive with sound, a deafening roar of marching feet, the cries of soldiers long dead, and the shuffling whispers of countless souls, all merging together into a single unearthly cry. The man was sure that the mansion itself was alive, and that whatever they had started, whatever they had uncovered, was only the beginning. But was it too late to stop? Or had they already become part of Paxton Mansion's dark, eternal story? The air in Paxton Mansion grew unbearably heavy, the spirits' voices blending into a single, chilling chorus. The man felt the walls close in as the soldiers surrounded them, their eyes pleading, their hands reaching for the living. The mansion groaned as if in response, a final warning before the inevitable. The man stepped forward, his voice shaking. "We'll remember. We'll tell your story." At those words, a deep, echoing silence filled the room. The spirits, as if hearing their salvation, seemed to relax, their forms flickering like candlelight. The woman in white, her face softening, nodded slowly, her figure beginning to dissipate. The soldiers faded one by one, their faces no longer twisted in agony but peaceful, as though they had finally been released from their torment. The temperature in the mansion returned to normal, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere lifting as the last echoes of the soldiers' march faded into silence. The group stood motionless, unsure if they had just witnessed a miracle or a curse. The man, still shaken, turned to leave, his heart heavy with the weight of the promise he'd made. As they stepped out into the night, the mansion behind them was still, its dark silhouette now just a shadow in the moonlight. But as they walked away, one last whisper echoed in the wind, a voice barely audible but unmistakably clear. "Remember, or we will return." And with that, Paxton Mansion stood silent once more waiting. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.